Okay, today I'll be talking about something a little bit different than what I usually talk about. It's still kind of tangentially involved with history, including the history of World War II and various ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union that were deported by Stalin. But uh, that's not his main focus. Also dealing with the greater discipline of Oriental studies, coming from the Latin Orient, meaning East, but basically uh, Westerners, people from Europe and the U.S., and who study Asia. In this particular case, we're dealing with an individual who was a linguist, particularly of Urdu and Baluchi, from what is now Pakistan. But I'm going to have a historical context around it. So we're talking about uh, M.A.R. Barker, and he used the initials M.A.R. because the name he took when he converted to Islam, Muhammad Abdul Rahman. He didn't want everybody having to say peace be unto his name every time Muhammad, which is also the name of the prophet in Islam, was mentioned. So he was born as Philip Barker in Spokane, Washington, and his father was a member of the German Bund, an American organization that was sympathetic to the National Socialist government in Germany that took power after Hitler was appointed Chancellor by President von Hindenburg in 1933. How much that has to do with what will happen in the late 80s and early 90s, and was just recently revealed officially by the foundation that has the intellectual property for his most famous work, which isn't on Orientalism, it's a role playing game. I don't know. But we're going to kind of discuss kind of the genealogy and ideological the nexus of ideas and phenomena here. So in 1951, he converted to Islam while on a trip to India. So his main academic focus uh, for most of his career was on uh, Indic languages, particularly I noted Urdu and Baluchi. But he would spend quite a bit of time in both India and Pakistan, and he ended up marrying a Pakistani woman. But in 1951, he does convert to Sunni Islam, and all accounts is that throughout his entire life, he was a Orthodox practitioner and a pious believer. But he kept his life very compartmentalized. So a lot of people didn't know about various sections of it. So he has an academic part of his life. He ends up taking his last academic position at University of Minnesota in 1972 until he retires. He has the religious aspect of his life. He is a Muslim and involved in the local Ummah, but also the Islamic community in Montreal, where he sets up Islamic Center with his father-in-law. Uh, and then there's what he's noted famous for is the role-playing game came out in the 1970s, Empire of the Petal Throne. And a lot of the people in his mosque even yet alone other Muslims he was in contact with in North America and South Asia. Had no idea about this aspect of his life, really. Uh, so, I mean, there are Muslim role players, but most of them were playing Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s and not Empire of the Petal Throne or Tekamel, I believe the name of the world. Uh, so he kind of kept that separate. Also, in his actual gaming circle, right, where he was actually running the game, there's a lot of occult stuff that's kind of buried that he was like to investigate and read about and study. And I think part of the reason why it's done under the auspices of fantasy role playing game, and later, starting in 1984, starts publishing books based upon this setting, is because obviously the occult is not something a Orthodox Muslim should be involved in. But the occult he was interested in, particularly, was coming from also the areas that he was interested in academically, and these areas are also the areas that influenced his role playing game design and novel writing. So, South Asia, interestingly enough, also Central America, pre-Columbian societies such as the Aztecs in what is today now Mexico. Uh, he did his PhD actually on Native American languages, or particularly one Native American language, Kalmuck, in the Pacific Northwest, where he was from. There's some speculation that he might have actually been part Kalmuk as far as ancestry. That's why he was selected, or at least in part selected, Kalmuk linguistics for his PhD, and his first academic publications were on Kalmuk language, dictionary, instructional materials, attempt to preserve a language that was, even back then, dying. So I'm not an expert on its status, but he would later move on to do mostly Urdu and Baluchi linguistics. But the occult that he was interested in, a lot of it from the Arab world, Persia, India. So these are countries under Islamic influence, obviously. First coming out of Arabia with Muhammad, and then later we have the conquest of Persia, and particularly it's branching off into Twelver Shiism under the Safavids, and then the Mughals coming from Central Asia, imposing Islam upon the Indian subcontinent. Now, well, he does have some interest in Persian occult. Obviously, religiously, he's definitely Sunni. Did not believe in any kind of bells and whistles. He wasn't a Salafist, but certainly not somebody who was into Sufism, certainly not publicly, although in his gaming and kind of private research, there's a lot on Islamic mysticism that he does. And certainly, obviously, Twelver Shiism or any other form of Shiism, such as the Seveners, he obviously was not involved in these lesser, smaller in terms of numbers of believers, strains of Islam. A number of people he was playing his games with in Minneapolis were actual outright occultist, working for the occult publisher there in Minneapolis. He seemed to think they didn't have a very good knowledge of the occult. Certainly not compared to himself, even for Western occult. But of course, obviously a lot of his occult coming from South Asia and the Middle East, being very, very little known to anybody in the U.S. So those are kind of the first three parts of his life. Academia, which focused on language. Islam, his chosen religion, and gaming, which he's most famous for, kind of a cult around Empire of the Petal Throne, lasting up until it looks like March. And after March, it is revealed publicly by the Tekamal Foundation, which has the intellectual property right to Empire of the Petal Throne, the game, and the novels, that he was the author of a novel published in 1991 by National Vanguard Books called Serpent's Walk. Now, National Vanguard Books is the publishing house. I don't know how much of this is current. I think the book is currently published by another publisher. I think it's called Delta. But anyway, the time it came out in 91, National Vanguard Books, which was associated with the National Alliance, I believe, under William Luther Pierce, who was a right-wing National Socialist, racist, white nationalist. I'm not exactly sure what exact label he would put on himself, but he had been a chemistry professor in Oregon and had then created this organization, managed to get it up to fairly well endowed from supporters. I think he had about $1 million coming in a year at its height. At any rate, he is probably most famous for being the pseudonymous author of the Turner Diaries, which was also published by National Vanguard Books. Both the Turner Diaries and Serpent's Walk are kind of fantasies of, in the case of Turner Diaries, white nationalists might be the term we would use. In the case of Serpent's Walk, they're actually surviving SS National Socialist from the World War II era that form an organization continue on after World War II. So they have kind of a revolution and take over the U.S. government and establish National Socialist policies in the novel written by Barker under the pseudonym of Randolph D. Calverhall, which was supposedly one of his ancestors. So that was the first revelation. He'd written this book, which is very sympathetic, puts on a very positive light to National Socialist ideas and National Socialism as a historical phenomena. So very, very unpopular and minority idea, especially in the United States. And he was also, from 1989 until they ceased publication, I believe in 2002, on the editorial board of the Journal of Historical Review, although I don't think he ever wrote anything that was published in the Journal of Historical Review. So the Journal of Historical Review is a World War II and Holocaust revisionist journal that sought to greatly minimize the consensus on the Holocaust regarding the number of Jews killed by the National Socialist during the Second World War. And initially, I think when they were found in '78, it was quite an extreme reduction. So the first kind of scholarly works on the Holocaust, Reitlinger, I think, put 4.5 million. Raoul Hilberg, 5.1 million. Consensus today is about 5.4 million in most of the academic works. I mean, so they were talking about hundreds of thousands rather than over 5 million. Or I suppose we could, if you go to the earlier figure, Reitlinger, and under 5 million, but certainly over 4 million. And I think a lot of the current revisionists, including the former head of the Institute of Historical Review, which put out the journal, Mark Weber, have now revised their numbers upwards somewhere around the 3 to 4 million. So they're much closer to the consensus number than they were in the 80s. And I believe Weber has said that the whole kind of idea of Holocaust revisionism was a waste of effort and time. And yeah, if your argument is that the Holocaust wasn't such a big deal because the number killed was 4.5 million rather than 5.5 million, it seemed kind of a really weird hill to die upon. He's probably right on that. He also thought that kind of the basis, attacking modern political structure they were opposed to, would be better served by just being kind of vanilla anti-Zionist rather than trying to revise the number of Jewish victims of National Socialism down from over 5 million to just a few 100,000, which obviously evidence from the Einsatz group and reports and other archives, the Germans, the number certainly in the millions. Not something I really delve into deeply, but as far as there being exaggeration, it's certainly not as nearly as exaggerated as the Institute of Historical Review was talking about. So there have been downward revisions, but I doubt we're ever going to see it get below 3 to 4 million, which is what the revisionists, the so-called Holocaust deniers, currently claim. So they've moved it way, way up from the 80s. But he was on the board in '89 to 2002, and I don't know what he did there, but it obviously doesn't look good. It's not a peer-reviewed journal. A lot of the stuff that they published in the '80s was, pretty much falsifiable from German archives and other information. Although sometimes they would have an interesting article that wasn't totally out there, but kind of the problem is the surrounding milieu made it everything tainted from the journal. So when you have actual, real scholarly disagreements by people like Ernst Nolte, the historian dispute, which I discussed in an earlier video here. Obviously, they weren't touching the American revisionist associated with it. And they also, the money was coming from people who had other extreme right-wing ideas that were considered unpalatable, coming from Willis Carto and the Liberty Lobby. So his name being on that board really kind of cinched it along with this novel, because even the novel is kind of supposed to be satire. He did write a Bindings of Ebon, I believe it was. At some time, it was like a fake Necromonicon, which is a fake book, anyways, but fake occult book, fake grimoire, to try and take the piss out of the occultist that he was playing with. So he basically took Indian occultism and filed off the serial numbers, as one would say. But if he was trying to do that with the novel, which has been argued by David Morris, I don't think that's what he was trying to do. I think he actually was attracted to National Socialist ideas. His presence on the Journal of Historical Review makes this kind of iffy because it shows that he was sympathetic and willing to put his name on the main journal for attempting to minimize, I won't say deny, because they never said there were no Jews killed, but minimize the Holocaust way below what the evidence that I've seen would support. But enough of that. This is not the main thrust of this video. All right, so let's summarize beliefs and interests. Barker, the complicated and compartmentalized individual. It's basically four parts of his life, and they're kept separate. So, academically, his job is based upon linguistics, language, particularly Urdu and Baluchi. In the 1960s, he wrote a number of instructional materials that were still being used at the School of Oriental and African Studies when I was there in the early 2000s. So it appears he's a competent Orientalist regarding linguistics. I don't know enough about linguistics. I don't speak any of the Eastern Indo-European languages. But I mean, they are still Indo-European. They're related more closely to English than languages like Finnish or Hungarian. But they're still, because coming out of Asia, considered part of the Orient or Oriental languages. So, I mean, again, Oriental means East in Latin. That's why the School of Oriental and African Studies. Ignore Edward Said's book trying to discredit our entire discipline of studying Asia. All right, the second one, gaming, fantasy, and the occult. Now, the gaming, what he's most known for, his novels, evidently were not written that well. Some people, I haven't gone through and read the novels. I've looked at the summaries and a little bit of the Serpent's Walk, the controversial novel. But people have stated he wasn't a great prose writer. Either his National Socialist novel, which some say actually written the best, or his fantasy novels. But the fantasy novels obviously go with the gaming. And I said that's what he's most known for. It's what he got the kind of cult of personality that lasted until March, and now everybody's abandoned him because of his writing The Serpent's Walk and being on the editorial board of the Journal of Historical Review. This is also where I said he kind of hides a lot of his interest in researching the occult. He's obviously not an occultist. I believe he was sincere in his belief in Sunni Islam. But obviously, it's not something he wanted other people in his mosque, other people in the Ummah to know about. Obviously, a good Muslim should not be looking around, reading text on the occult. All right. Then, of course, his religious life, which we've gone over here. And then this reveal part. Now, other than the book and being on the editorial board of JHR, I don't know anything about. We've supposedly said some things occasionally to people, but for the most part, again, it's compartmentalized and kept separate. But we do know he wrote the book. The archivist found his publishing contract with National Vanguard Books, as well as the proofs and the check, a copy of the check that he was paid by National Vanguard Books for writing it. And the original cover, I think the cover art. But anyway, the contract as well as the copy of the check have been verified as being to Muhammad Abdul Rahman Barker. But I'm not so he had the kind of like four little parts of his life. But I don't think it's that unusual for these things to kind of be the interest of a single individual. So there's been a nexus between these kinds of interest, ideas, areas of research since about the 1930s. So Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, National Socialist Germany, was into the occult. There were a lot of National Socialists were into Oriental scholarship. People like Otto Werber, who was a Mongol specialist, both Mongolian, but joined the Abwehr and was head of the Cavalry Corps, a group of Buddhist Mongols on the Caspian Sea, formed a military unit to fight against Soviet partisans. There are other German Orientalists who were enthusiastic National Socialists, and this was encouraged and supported by the German government at the time for geopolitical and foreign policy and military reasons. So that's not unusual either. You kind of see this combination of kind of popular depictions, things like Indiana Jones, right? Where you have a National Socialist in the Middle East looking for occult artifacts, or the Temple of Doom, I believe, took place in India. And again, the third movie, they're looking for the Holy Grail. So again, there's connection with the Middle East. Barker, I think, was somebody trying to seek truth in areas not normally looked at by white Americans, or any Americans for that matter, but new cultures. I think he honestly did become kind of awed by the Taj Mahal, and this is what spurs his conversion to Sunni Islam, and of course, I think this gets reinforced by his research into languages and cultures and peoples there. He lived for a long time at various times in both India and Pakistan. So I think rather than like a lot of leftists I see on the internet saying it's this idea, this exposure to these non-white, non-Western people should have been a bulwark against racism and National Socialism, but historically, I don't think it works that way. I think it's actually more likely to have been something that made it more attractive to National Socialist ideas. And there was a lot of this. And there is, of course, this whole idea of Aryanism, common linguistic roots, and he was a linguist between northern India, Pakistan, Iran, and Europe. Idea of Arianisms in 1936. The first Shah Pahlavi of Iran changes the name of Persia to Iran to get better relations with their largest trade partner, Germany. So we see this. I've already mentioned Otto Verba, the Cavalry Corps. A number of Muslims fought voluntarily for the German side during the Second World War. There were two SS divisions from the Balkans, one for Bosnian Muslims fighting against Tito's partisans, and one of Albanian Muslims. There were a number of Wehrmacht Eastern legions of Muslims from the North Caucasus, mostly Dagestan, from Azerbaijan, from Turkestan, which is basically Kazakhstan and Central Asia, recruited from prisoners of war, as well as what was called Ideological, which is the area on the Volga River, Tatarstan, and Bashkiria. There were also self-defense forces from Crimean Tatars to guard against Soviet partisans. So, and there were Arabs from North Africa, Middle East, who fought with the Germans as well. Now, I kind of brought up Iran already, but it's in Iran and Iraq in 1941, still early in the war. There was basically a British invasion of both of them to conquer them. So in Iran, because the Shah is pro-German and very anti-British, as are many Iranians, because of the machinations of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Corporation, which will lead to the coup in '53, backed by the CIA, Operation Ajax. But AIOC today is British Petroleum. So the British and the Soviets invade Iran, overthrow Mohammed Pahlavi, exile him to South Africa, put his son, who was very young, on the throne. So Shah Mohammed Reza Pahlavi II, who will be overthrown in '79. But basically, Iran is occupied in the south by the British. There's also American forces there. In the north by the Soviets, and loses its sovereignty during the course of the Second World War. And when the Soviets pull out, they try and keep, through satellite regimes, the northwestern part of Iran, the Azerbaijani Democratic Republic, and the Kurdistan Republic, better known as the Mahabad Republic, both of which are crushed by the Iranians once the United States throws its backing behind a stronger and actually independent Iran after the end of the Second World War. In Iraq, there's a nationalist coup backed by Germany and Italy and Vichy France. In 1941, they are pro-German, pro-Italian, and anti-British. The British basically re-invade Iraq. Had gotten its independence in 1932, and they conquer Baghdad and reestablish their control and authority. And at the end of this invasion and conquest of Iraq by the British, there is a pogrom in Baghdad, kills 128 Jews who are perceived as having backed and supported the British invasion and reoccupation of Iraq. So we see, and we can see in the Ba'athist ideology, people like Michel Aflaq, the influence of things like Italian fascism, but also the Western allies were not very well liked in the Islamic world. The British had been in control of Iraq after they took it from the Ottoman Empire after World War I. You have aerial bombardments of the Kurdish areas at this time by the British. You have the horrible exploitation of the Persian oil fields by Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. British colonial rulers in British India, which still includes Pakistan and Bangladesh at this time, as well as much of Africa. All right, so this idea that the Americans and the British are the good guys and everybody should support them because the Germans are racist and therefore hate all brown and black people, it just doesn't show up. The British were the ones who were oppressing more brown and black people than anybody else. It wasn't the Germans. If we were to then go to the second largest repressor of blacks and other non-white people, probably the United States, followed by the Soviet Union. The Germans were supporting independence for India under Botha. The Germans had a number of non-white units, as I mentioned here, that were Muslim, as well as others, the Kalmucks, were Buddhist, fighting for them. So it's not nearly as cut as dry. I think part of the problem, and I'll get to this, is the idea that Jews are somehow black people, which is advocated by Jewish leaders and organizations in the United States today. And it's just not true in the course of the 1940s. So the conflation of American historical racism, like the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan was very anti-Nazi during World War II. Lots of Southerners who supported Jim Crow laws went enthusiastically to fight against the Nazis. Probably more of them preferred to fight against the Japanese, but they were not by any means pro-German. And the Germans were not supporters of the KKK, the famous anti-American poster. One of the things that is being pointed to and attacked is the Ku Klux Klan. All right. So to associate National Socialist anti-Semitism with the type of anti-black racism practiced by the United States, by the British, Union of South Africa had segregation. We have white minority rule in Rhodesia and Kenya. Many white South Africans, white Rhodesians, volunteered to fight against the Nazis, and the Italian fascists were crucial in throwing the Italians out of Ethiopia. Right? It's just not the way Antifa and the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center claim it is, right? The fact is, the United States and Great Britain were the centers of anti-black racism in the 1940s, not Germany. There are very few blacks in Germany, most of them mixed race, and many of them treated fairly well. A colleague of mine from Ghana has written on this in a collection we put out, but a lot of them served in propaganda films against British colonialism in Africa. Some went to camps, but again, far fewer than the Americans, Japanese that were interned, 120,000 during the Second World War. And of course, we could talk about Soviet atrocities against people who were not white. Kalmucks, all 100,000 of them deported to Siberia, over 20% of them dying as a direct result of that genocide. It's hard to say that the Allies were pro-people of color when you look at such things. All right. So this is, I think, where we get to confusion. And it's why I've got that little article on a short note regarding Allied and Axis atrocities during the Second World War, which I'm linking to at the bottom from my Substack. But we can look at a whole host of Soviet atrocities against Asian peoples under Stalin. We can look at the deportation of the ethnic Koreans in 1937 to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, the Kazakh famine, which killed over 1 million people, quarter of their population. And of course, the British, we have things like the Bengal famine, predominantly Muslim area in eastern India and what is today Bangladesh. Maybe as many as 3 million people basically deliberately starved by the British under Churchill during the Second World War. It doesn't get any play because despite all this claim that to oppose Nazism is to oppose crimes against brown people, it's bullshit. It really is. It totally. Because there weren't any brown people or black people under German rule. The brown people and black people that were oppressed and being killed by the Allies. All right. And I think it's come to Jews today claim to be people of color, and this makes it very unclear. But opposition to Zionism and even actual anti-Semitism, that is opposition to Jews as a folk or naroda people, I think it's always been, at least since 1948, with the expulsion of 800,000 Palestinians, more common in the non-white world than it has been in Europe and the United States, where there's been philo-Semitism and Zionism actively promoted by the state and official culture for decades now. All right, and we see this, black Americans, black Africans, they don't view Jews as people of color the way the Jewish organizations claim to be. They view them as being super white people, like the elite of the white people, like the worst of the white people. This is why organizations like the Black Panthers were openly pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist. They saw through this, and the greatest supporter during the 1980s of apartheid South Africa was the State of Israel. They were violating the embargo, even on nuclear weapons, to provide to the apartheid regime. So when we look at it this way, right, it's not that, well, he doesn't like Jews, or he doesn't like Israel, so he must hate black people and brown people. Lots of black people and brown people not real fans of Jews, particularly the Israelis. It's hard to find too many Arabs, not a lot of black Africans that enthusiastically support. I mean, there are now a number of black Zionists among Christians in places like Nigeria, but if you go to South Africa, the ANC is still strongly anti-Zionist. So I think this is really where we have the problem. So this idea that Barker was a white supremacist, a Ku Klux Klan type guy, because he wrote a book sympathetic to National Socialism, is silly, and it shows a lack of thought, kind of the nuances here, or not even nuances, just basic facts that. The Nazi racism was aimed first against Jews, second against Slavs, both of which have white skin. There were lots of people with brown skin fighting in German units, lots of people with brown and black skin getting support from the Germans against their British colonial masters, whom they viewed as the primary enemy, not the Germans. And lots of atrocities committed by the Allies against people of color. So the Bengali famine, done by the British, not by the Germans. Deportation of the Kalmucks into Siberia to die, done by the Soviets, the Allies, not by the Germans. Internment of Japanese Americans, Jim Crow laws. This was done by the Americans, not by the Germans. So, conclusion. Barker was not a KKK type white nationalist, racist against people of color. He was a strong proponent of preserving and promoting Native American, South Asian, and Islamic cultures. But at the same time, he also was highly sympathetic to National Socialism. In his novel, he, of course, greatly downplays their atrocities and crimes, not just against Jews. Lots of Gentiles, Greeks, Ukrainians, Poles, were killed by the Nazis. They were quite brutal in their anti-partisan warfare in the Soviet Union and in Poland and in Yugoslavia. So even if we take the Holocaust away, we're still talking about millions of innocent civilians in Europe, some being killed for reasons that have a racial component. The Slavs in Poland and Ukraine and Russia and Serbia, but also, just kind of the violence to maintain military authority and occupation against peoples who had been independent in Europe and did not want to come under the rule of Berlin. So, yeah, he does whitewash these things, no doubt about it. But again, the Germans championed Indian independence during the war against the British. They supported Botha materially to fight against the British. There are still supporters of Botha who are sympathetic to National Socialism in India as a result of this history. So again, it's not so clear cut. It's not that Jews are people of color and they're in this alliance against evil Nazis that are composed of just white people. That's not at all how the world works. All right, so and when you think about that the British killed 3 million people in Bengal, percentage-wise, yes, it's much smaller than German crimes against National Socialists, but in terms of absolute numbers, it's over half as many, and it gets very, very little attention. Leftists, for all their claim to love brown people, really don't care about colonial atrocities committed in the name of anti-fascism. That's why you never hear about the Kalmuks, you never hear about the Chechens, the Karachais, Balkars, all of these non-white people that were genocided by Stalin during the Second World War. Crimean Tatars. He was hostile to what he perceived to be as organized Jewish political power. And I think that was beyond just opposition to Zionism. I don't know if he specifically said too much about Zionism. He does have supposedly one joke about the Mossad, but not unusual for Muslims and basically anybody outside of Europe and the United States to be critical and hostile to Israel and Jewish political power as represented by the Zionists. But I think this did go into a dislike of the group. So I would say, yeah, we could classify it as anti-Semitism, opposition to the Jewish folk or Narod. Although not all Jews, he did say he wasn't going to show the manuscript to Serpent Walk to the Volheims, who were Jewish friends of his. So obviously, on personal relationships, he made exceptions that there was every Jew was involved in a nefarious conspiracy. I don't know if he thought it was conspiracy per se or just that kind of the ethnopolitics of this put them, for the most part, as a group on the opposite side. But I mean, he is a Muslim. He is, I say, openly on the side of the peoples in South Asia, Pakistanis, his wife, sympathetic also, as far as I can see, to Persians and Arabs. None of these people are Zionist. None of these people think that Israel and its foundation through the expulsion of the Palestinians is a good thing. Right? The idea that you have to support crimes against the Palestinians to be anti-racist only exists in the United States. It does not exist anywhere else, not even in Great Britain. And there, the left is anti-imperialist and corporate. The one other place that exists is Germany. In Germany, the far left is very, very pro-Israeli. Anti-Deutsche, the Antifa in Germany, is also militantly pro-Zionist. But the United States and Germany are the only countries where that's like that. Ireland, IRA, very pro-PLO, as well as supporting groups like the African National Congress in South Africa. ANC itself, very pro-PLO. Even today, ANC government in South Africa, strongly pro-Palestinian, in large part because Israel was such a strong supporter of the apartheid regime. The idea that all whites in the world should support, the idea that all non-whites in the world should support Zionist colonialism in Palestine because American Jews claim to be non-white, right, is basically only an idea that is accepted in America. Nobody in India, well, maybe less so India, nobody in South Africa, nobody in West Africa, really, or certainly not intellectuals in Ghana. But historically, certainly in the time of the 70s and particularly 80s, they weren't going to have anybody who considered themselves supporters of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism world come out and say, "Oh yes, we support Israel." No, in the 1970s and 1980s that did not happen. Uh, uh, so this is a silly idea. The silly idea that if you want to be a progressive and support people of color, you have to support Israel 100% and the expulsion and occupation and repression of the Palestinians. That idea has been common in the United States since 1948, but it is not an idea that anybody outside the United States really accepted in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, and I don't even think they accepted it in the 1990s as well. All right. His interest in fantasy and the occult and long history of dovetailing with right-wing and anti-Semitic ideas and confluence. I brought up Indiana Jones movies. Steven Spielberg, who is himself Jewish from Hollywood. But I mean, his ideas he kind of took from older pulp ideas that were running around. But obviously, Himmler and other Nazi officials didn't make any bones about their interest in the occult. There wasn't any secret about long-standing German interest in the Orient being reinforced by the National Socialist. Certainly, Har goes to Tibet, 7 years in Tibet, right? He was a member of the National Socialist Party, but very pro-Tibetan, very supportive of Tibetan freedom struggle that later comes about in 1959 against the People's Republic of China. All right, so this idea that you have to be a Zionist and support Israel 100% if you're going to be, supporting opposition to racism against brown and black and yellow people is silly. Lots of brown and black and yellow people don't like Israel, all right? And some of them don't like Jews at all. And I think that this is where we have here part of the idea with Barker as to why we have attraction to anti-Semitism. And since obviously the book isn't about the Arab struggle against Israel, it's about actual real German National Socialist struggling against the U.S. government. But again, if you look at World War II, the U.S. government was doing more bad things against people of color, real people of color, not Jews, than the Germans were. They just weren't people of color under German rule, except in North Africa. And if you look at atrocities by the Germans in North Africa, they're not against the Berbers and Arabs. They're against the small Jewish minority in places like Tunisia and Libya. All right, so I think this is a confusion. All right, so once you get rid of the idea that somehow Jews are black and realize that, well, black people consider Jews to be white, all right, and that the Nazi opposition to the Jewish folk, as it were, this war against the people, does not mean that they were going to have wars against, the peoples that American racists who were anti-Nazi, and in some cases pro-Jewish, thought they should. All right, so it's not the same. It's not comparable. So he wasn't a white nationalist. He wasn't a white supremacist. Barker was very much sympathetic to Native Americans, South Asians, other people from non-European cultures. He was anti-Semitic. It certainly goes beyond just anti-Zionism. He was sympathetic to National Socialism. He does whitewash it. Their crimes against Jews as well as other people You can do what you want with that, but I got kind of a conclusion here. So you can claim, as I've seen on board after board after board, that National Socialist ideas as opposed to National Socialist practice. So you judge the practice. So what they did in Greece, for instance, starving 300,000 Greeks, that's bad. That's evil. But that's not a belief. That's something that they did in practice, right? National Socialist occupation. Right? But you can believe that the National Socialists are inherently evil, and anybody expressing any sympathy with them is, like Barker did, is completely evil incarnate, and all his work should be dismissed because it's tainted by evil National Socialist ideas, such as having ethno-states is one that's mentioned in the. Although Israel is an ethno-state, the Soviet Union was a union of various ethno-states, some which were destroyed during the war, some of which were not white that were destroyed during the war, the Chechens, Ingush, Karachais, Balkars, Crimean Tatars, and of course the Kalmucks, who have this association through the Kalmuk Cavalry Corps, about 5,000 out of 100,000 of fighting under Otto Werber in anti-partisan units. All right. But I want to quote another famous Orientalist. It also deals with India, Muslim part of India, but over in he's a historian and dealing with Bengal. So Peter Robb, who was my tutor for my PhD, School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, he says, if all you're going to do is write colonialism is wicked on the board, and not do anything more, then just write it on the board, right? Right. So if it's Nazism is evil, just write it on the board, and then we're done. We don't do any more research. We can remain ignorant of everything. We go to the pub and glory in our ignorance of everything because we know Nazism is evil as an ideology. We don't need to know anything more else. We can remain ignorant as these people like to do. We can forget about all the nuances. We can claim falsely that it was the Germans and not the British that were killing brown people in Bengal in 1940s. But the historical record says elsewhere, right? So the fact is that Jews are not people of color. So, like, the anti-black racism in the United States is not the same as anti-Jewish racism in Europe. And certainly, we look at the actual record, right? There are plenty of Asian and African peoples being subjected to horrible treatment by the Allies during and after the Second World War. It has nothing to do with German National Socialism. It has nothing to do with National Socialist anti-Semitism. They're just completely and totally different things at this point. All right, so if we don't want to have any research, we don't have any thinking, we just want to go to the pub and say, just as people that Rob was criticizing, colonialism is wicked. Well, okay, colonialism is wicked, and you don't need to study the centuries that the British ruled over South Asia to try and understand it, which is something he was rejecting. Yeah, Nazism is evil. We don't need to study what actually happened. We can give a free pass to the Americans and the British and the Soviets for the period of time 1941 to 1945. Kalmucks don't count, and they don't have a strong lobby in the United States, so nobody cares. All right. So that's it. That's what I got. But Barker complicated and compartmentalized the figure, and he was pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic. And if that's a deal breaker for you for everything else he's done, then so be it. But I find it interesting case study of how these ideas all come together. All right, that's it for me.